What are the economics of podcasts? Is the CHIPS Act working? And is the U.S. corporate tax system worse than China's? I'm Dominic Pino, Thomas L. Rhodes Journalism Fellow with the National Review Institute, and we'll look through those questions on this episode of eConception. eConception is a podcast of the American Institute for Economic Research that looks at the economic issues of the day and the broader economic concepts behind them. We're recording today on location from the barrier to entry in the podcast market. It's very low, and we'd like to keep it that way. Our guest today is Emily Jashinsky. She is the host of two podcasts, one called Undercurrents with Unheard and another one called Counterpoints, where she is the conservative side of the debate. But I really wanted to have Emily on the show because she is extremely knowledgeable on podcasts and how they work and how the economics of media has changed in recent years. And so I thought she would be a really great person to have on to talk about it. She's passionate about it and knowledgeable about it. So thanks for coming on, Emily.
Thank you for having me, Dominic.
All right. So I guess the first thing to say is, what is a podcast? How did podcasts start? Because it seems like no one person really invented podcasts, and then all of a sudden they appeared and now they're absolutely everywhere. So what happened there?
It's really funny because I remember when I was a teenager and iTunes first came out, Apple started pushing this idea of something called a podcast. And there were a couple of people who really took it seriously and got into the art of the podcast very early. But then it kind of dipped. You stopped hearing about podcasts until, as best as I can remember it, about 2015. Unless you were a hardcore listener of one of those people who got in the podcast game early. And Joe Rogan is among those individuals who had the prescience to recognize how powerful this format could be. But around 2015, I would say, is when podcasts really started to take off. Absolutely exploded during the pandemic when people sort of necessarily started doing business over Zoom, and Zoom turned out to be a great podcasting platform, and it kind of snowballed down the hill. And there are other softwares that took off. The one we're recording this on right now, Riverside, really took off during the pandemic. So part of it was just the technical response to the need of video conferencing, also made for great podcasting software. And those two, the confluence of those two events made it really, really easy. And the easier it was, the more people got into it. And the more people got into it, the more people wanted a taste of that same type of potential success. There's an element of the American dream when people think of podcasting, that you can enter it and become really successful because there's algorithms on Instagram and Twitter and TikTok that can take your content meteoric to a meteoric rise and stratospheric really quickly. So it started, I think, really revving back up around the time Donald Trump hit the political scene, as so many different things began changing. A lot of that was just being able to offer independent voices apart from the kind of legacy media. So the technical side of it got a little bit easier, and also the audience's appetite for content that was outside the lines of how legacy media was talking. That really started, I think, revving it all back up. I would put it around 2015, 2016, to be honest. Some people might put it later than that, but it was a thing, 10 years before.
Mm-hmm. And I think the key economic concept behind this is barriers to entry, like you were mentioning before, and that it's just so easy to do podcasts now. And that's why there's so many of them. In the past, to reach a large audience through broadcast media, you had to have a TV studio. You had to invest a ton of money in getting, professional lighting and professional microphones and all the rest of this stuff. And now you just need something like Riverside, like we're using right now, which all I had to do is just send you a link in an email. And, we've got pretty solid microphones here that are a little bit expensive, but compared to building a TV studio, that's nothing.
Well, let's talk about the microphones, because the microphones are a huge component of what's made podcasting popular. I am using the Shure SM7B. You are using the Shure MV7. The Shure MV7 came out around the time of the pandemic because it is the digital version, essentially, of the Shure SM7B, which is an extremely popular microphone among radio broadcasters going way back before there was such a thing as a podcast. It's an extremely, extremely popular standard microphone, and people are very familiar with it because they see Joe Rogan with it. They see all kinds of, Megyn Kelly uses it. It's popular in the podcasting world. But when you had the MV7 come out and Rode makes basically a version of the MV7 that's a popular alternative to the XLR mics, that just lets people plug in with USB. You don't have to have an audio interface. You don't have to have anything other than a computer and the microphone to get really, really good sound. I mean, the MV7 is an incredible microphone. It's, the Shure SM7B itself is not that expensive these days. So all of that is to say, we don't need a license to be recording this, to get this to people's ears. We don't need a massive corporation to get this to people's ears. All we need right now is a laptop and a microphone, and we could get all of that for under $1,000, essentially. And that's even cheaper and even easier now that the demand for podcasts and video conferencing. I mean, I think you can't ignore how much the move to remote work caused people to want to have high quality audio on conferencing calls, which caused these companies to say, let's make cheap digital mics. And, people who want to mess around on their guitar, on their laptop, they can use the MV7. They don't have to get the SM7B. They don't have to get an interface. They don't have to get a soundboard. They don't have to get XLR cords. All they need is to plug up right there. So some of this was just demand. People are staying home more from work. They're doing more of their work over the internet. They're doing webinars, for example. Like all these things that aren't even podcasts started rising with podcasts during the pandemic because just more stuff is being done digitally. And that has made podcasting even cheaper and more accessible, which starts, I think, this ball the snowball rolling faster and faster down the hill. Because things like microphones, there was a market demand for the MV7. There was a market demand that made these other guys cheaper because there was just more of them being sold. And a lot of these audio companies now have a version of the microphone that you're using or have cheaper versions of the microphone that I'm using and have made it even easier to just plug in and go.
Yeah, and in order to just plug in and go, we didn't have to ask the FCC for permission. We didn't have to buy. We didn't have to buy a part of the radio spectrum. And to buy a radio frequency. We didn't have to do any of the things that you used to have to do if you wanted to reach a really large audience. And I think the lack of barriers to entry, both in the sense that the startup costs are lower for market reasons, like you just outlined, but also the government barriers to entry are much less. And that creates some controversy, though, around podcasts, too, because anybody can just plug in and say whatever they want. There's a lot of nonsense and garbage out there that a lot of people are troubled by. What do you think about sort of the future of podcast regulation? Because we can see an appetite for it among a lot of different people.
Oh my gosh, yeah. Just about an hour or two before we went to tape on this podcast, the Washington Post dropped what became a long-awaited story after they started sending comment requests to conservative podcasters, Ben Shapiro, Dan Bongino, and Charlie Kirk in particular, asking about their dissemination of alleged disinformation related to the 2020 election on podcasting platforms. And Ben, who I think is the most serious of those three, came out and said, this is an effort to undermine conservative media. This is an effort to demonetize conservative media. And we can debate what was or what was not said on the show. But I think the bottom line is there, to your point, Dominic, is absolutely an appetite to lay the groundwork for a potential licensing scheme, for potential heavier disinformation regulation in the podcasting space, because it has always been, television has always been regulated and radio has always been pretty regulated. That doesn't mean that it was impossible. Like SiriusXM was responding to an appetite basically for unfiltered Howard Stern for hours and hours and hours. It's sort of the proto podcast. It's like, hey, some people just want to hear Stern. They just want to hear this guy and they want to hear him with no filter. They want to hear him for hours on end in a way that terrestrial radio can't deliver. So in a sense, Howard Stern really laid the groundwork here. But I think it's going to be, there's too much money on the line my take on this is that there's too much money on the line for Apple and Spotify to allow that to happen. I will imagine they will have lobbyists flooding Washington because Ben Shapiro is a responsible broadcaster. There's no question about it. And he also brings tons of money into Apple and Spotify and YouTube. And it's there's a reason that people subscribe to Spotify Premium, and Joe Rogan is part of it. Joe Rogan himself is a significant part of it. And he's one of the people who was targeted by a comment request at the Washington Post because he let Donald Trump say something about the 2020 election that the Post wasn't happy about, even though Joe Rogan was asking Trump in this exchange for proof. He said, when are you going to offer proof that the 2020 election was stolen? He was saying that in this exchange, but because Donald Trump was allowed as the former president to speak freely in his answers to Rogan, Washington Post sent him one of these comment requests and mentioned him in this hit piece. So my take on it is when you're going after the big guns like Joe Rogan, Ben Shapiro, Dan Bongino, these people have massive audiences, and those massive audiences are bringing so much money into Apple and Spotify that even if you target the top 5 to 10 conservative podcasters and you start drawing lines about what can and cannot be said, it's just way too much money on the line for Apple and Spotify when you pool those shows together. That is just an incredible sum. And it also risks then those companies having to do the same thing to popular shows on the left. If they end up spreading disinformation and you're under a Trump presidency or you're under a DeSantis presidency or a Vance presidency, and you have, more control of the regulatory agencies by Republicans when Democrats come out and start talking about sex and gender. Once you get into that game, there's just so much money on the line for those companies that I don't see it, honestly, ever happening in the way that maybe it could have if they had gotten into it earlier.
Yeah, I think it's a classic case of if you give the government power to do something, about half the time it's going to be controlled by people you don't like. So you should probably be a little bit concerned about that. I want to talk about Joe Rogan and specifically because he would, he just had Donald Trump on, as you mentioned. He's had JD Vance on now. He wanted to have Kamala Harris on as well, but that hasn't happened yet. And when Spotify picked up Rogan and was carrying and started carrying his podcast, Spotify got huge backlash from lots of different people. They didn't end up listening to it, and they've, as you said, made a ton of money as a result. But Rogan is interesting because he has this enormous audience. He does a very untraditional thing in media. Like there aren't really very many other shows like his, and if there are, they're nowhere near as successful. And yet, it's kind of hard to quantify in the way that we can quantify television, right? Television, we have Nielsen ratings we can look at and have a pretty good idea of how many people are watching any given television program. It's much harder with podcasts. Why is it that the metrics and the audience measurement for podcasts are so tricky to get a handle on?
Yeah, I've been behind the scenes on a number of podcasts, some of which are really popular and others which are not. And it's amazing what a black box exists. And this is especially true with podcasts that are really popular and understanding the full contour of your audience. There are some tools that people have some confidence in. They feel like they're getting a good understanding because then they need to take those numbers to advertisers. But frankly, like Apple, not super upfront with creators. Like that might change. There's just, again, it's for advertisers. And it did change already. There's already been some back and forth on this, and there's more transparency with the numbers now. And the reason for that was to be able to market yourself more honestly to advertisers to make more money, or to kind of pop what was called this like big podcast bubble after COVID. People said, listen, there's this massive oversaturation in the market, and nobody knows if their ad dollars are like really going in the right places. And so then Apple steps in, similar to what we saw happen in a way with Facebook, when Facebook tamped down on its clickbait algorithm and the video algorithm in the mid 2010s. There were a lot of news outlets that had pivoted to video in a very specific way to cater to the Facebook algorithm. News websites that had been set up in a way that catered specifically to the Facebook algorithm. And what can happen when you depend on one platform in particular, everyone's learned this now, but it happened again with the podcasting bubble to some extent, even if it was more predictable. They can come in and just sort of puncture that and say, actually, your numbers aren't that good and you're going to lose ad revenue. For some people, they learned their podcasts were super, super successful. But still, just because there are so many different ways people listen to podcasts, it's amazing, right? Like it's not, you don't have to just tune into one channel on one, system, which is cable, or let alone like antenna broadcast or all of that. So you can actually just listen to 10 minutes of a podcast versus the whole thing. You can download podcasts onto your iPhone that you never actually listened to. That's part of what Apple cracked down on recently is, just a download doesn't count as a play. So they're not tracking those things. Or you can download a podcast and then watch the video on YouTube because that algorithm gives it to you. And so you can start to try to cobble together a picture of what's happening, and changes over time obviously will help measure how well a show is doing. But it's just really, really hard, to your point, Dominic. Like it's as simple as what you said. It's just much harder to have a full, accurate picture of your audience, so much as you can have snippets of what's changing over time.
Yeah, and what do you think about the content that we usually find on podcasts? Is there a difference in content for the different medium than you would expect from television or from radio?
There's a huge difference. And that isn't to say regular television shows aren't successful as podcasts, because actually a lot of people don't realize this, but MSNBC is pretty good about just putting out their shows as podcasts. And we've seen the same thing with radio. There are some people who have basically started taping traditional radio shows a little bit more like podcasts, but they still resemble traditional radio shows. And they do really well in the podcast charts. Actually, Dan Bongino is one of those people. Buck Sexton and Clay Travis, another group of people who do something really similar. Megyn Kelly obviously simulcasts on SiriusXM and podcasts. But what's interesting is that when Megyn wants to go over, she will. So if she wants to go over, she'll say, thank you so much to the SiriusXM audience for listening. I want to keep talking about this topic, so you can check it out later on YouTube or download the podcasts. And that makes all the difference in the world, I think, for independent people outside of legacy spaces. So over at Breaking Points, where I host a show called Counterpoints with Ryan Grimm once and sometimes twice a week, it looks and feels like cable news. And that is the goal that Saagar Enjeti and Crystal Ball, both of whom had extensive experience in cable news before they went over to The Hill and made Rising the success that it became. They said, there's these two things happening at once. All of a sudden, people are doing podcasting and independent media, but we have this beautiful set that looks like a news set. Why don't we kind of combine them? Because then we can appeal to multiple generations at the same time. Younger people, it's important to them. They've said this to everyone from the New Yorker to the Federalist. It's important to them that it looks like something that you can show your parents, right? Even if they're talking about something totally different, it's familiar to people in older generations, and the content is familiar to people in younger generations who want to hear what's seen as like more transparent. They're all subscribers. They take a little bit of money from YouTube ads, I think. I don't actually know, but the chunk of the business is subscriber based, similar to what people do on Substack. So when that's your business, you don't have to do pharma ads. You don't have to worry about not offending pharma, who's going to, pharma is like the heaviest advertiser on cable news. It's like, and they wield that intentionally in a way. You want to get their money's worth when they're advertising on these channels. And we've seen reporting from inside some of those networks that suggests there is pressure at any given time. So when you don't have any of those pressures, when you don't have to worry about the executive who has worked at Comcast for 20 years and oversees your programming, because it's just you, when you don't have to worry about corporate politics, and I don't mean that in a politics sense, like an election sense. I mean that in terms of like the interpersonal dynamics of a corporate newsroom. You can be, and that is for better or worse, right? Sometimes it's for worse, and sometimes it's for better. Megyn Kelly is a really good example of someone with immense legacy media talent, someone who can present on the Today Show, everywhere from Fox News to the Today Show, and do it beautifully, but is also way less filtered in this podcasting format. So it's obviously a double-edged sword. You can have some people who look really relatively official. I think of Nick Fuentes is kind of a good example of this, who has a nice microphone, not a super expensive microphone, but he probably has a $500,000 microphone. He's got a decent camera. And if you watch his videos, they look a little bit more professional than someone in front of a webcam talking into the computer microphone. but he says insane things. And he would have never, ever had as big of an audience as he does if you weren't also able to listen to Ben Shapiro and more responsible podcasters. It's absolutely double-edged sword. There's no way around that. I completely agree.
Yeah, so let's talk about making money, because it's a weird medium in one sense, because most people get the product for free, right? You don't usually need to pay for a lot of different podcasts. They're all available for free to download on a variety of different platforms, and so you're not directly paying for that in a lot of cases. However, there are, as you mentioned, subscription-based models where people are paying a subscription, whether that's part of a package in a larger publication, or it's just a subscription for that podcast. There was just a recent news story about the podcast The Rest is History, which I'm a fan of. I enjoy listening to that podcast. But but the two hosts of that podcast, they make about £1 million a year. They're British, so it's in pounds, but they make about £1 million a year from that podcast because they've got 45,000 paying subscribers, but they have over 1 million listeners. And so there's this huge difference. I don't pay a penny for Rest is History. I'm not part of their subscriber base, but yet I get
You're missing out.
Yeah, I guess. But I still get to enjoy the podcast, and they make $1 million a year off of it, which is crazy amounts of money. But most of, that's of course in a very outlier case. The vast majority of podcasts don't make money at all. How is this another situation where we haven't quite figured out how this works yet, and sort of, the market's still playing out, or what do you think about the revenue potentials from podcasts?
Yeah, I mean, as somebody who's part of a podcast that has actually a couple podcasts and has been a part of a couple podcasts where the subscriber base is the business model, I'm not worried about the ones that I'm a part of because they've been around for a while. But I think newer players in the game, I think there's a real subscriber bubble right now, and it's not just in podcasts. I think it's in Substacks. I think it's in news subscriptions and media subscriptions more broadly. We are starting to see, I think, a little bit of the air be sucked out of that balloon, but I don't think it's anything like it will be because you're even just like informally in the pop culture space, jokes about everybody's subscriptions are, I don't know if you've noticed, Dominic, I feel like we're starting to get like a better sense of humor because we're looking around and realizing, I forgot that I subscribed to the Rest is History Club, and I haven't listened to a podcast in forever because, I haven't been traveling, or, you know what I mean? Like or I haven't been driving. So I think we are probably, I don't know if we're at peak subscription, but that certainly happened with the streaming. So the streaming services, like people stopped there was a peak subscription period. And it's when Apple and Disney got in that people started, that hit some of the other streamers that have been around for a while harder. And then we started to see consolidation. So we may see more consolidation, more like networks bundling podcasts together. So Rest is History. There's also a show called Rest is Politics. I think Goal Hanger is the company that does all of this. Maybe what we eventually see is a subscription where it's consolidated, where you can get Rest is History and Rest is Politics for a lump monthly sum. I think that's probably coming, and I think some people just lose out on that. But the subscriber model is better for the integrity of the product, and I think it's also really it's a safer model than advertising. If you're really dependent on advertising, and that could be YouTube ads, that could be dynamic ads that are put into podcasts. I remember at Federalist Radio Hour, we would get emails all the time from people who are like, I can't believe you put this advertisement on Federalist Radio Hour. And then you awkwardly have to explain, well, they're dynamic. So they're based on your browsing history, or they're based on your cookies, essentially.
We have a similar thing in National Review on our website where people will be like, why did you advertise? It's like, we did not pick that ad. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so podcast advertisers realized they could insert dynamic ads into the podcast platform, which has become a lot more popular. It's just easier to sell ads on smaller shows, so you can spread out your base. You don't just have to say, I know exactly who is listening to Megyn Kelly, which, by the way, it's very hard to know who's listening to the podcast, as we were talking about earlier, like what their demo is on average and who you should target with ads. But that's where YouTube comes in, because if you put your show on YouTube and on a podcast, you get better insight into the audience. Everyone knows the audience is different on YouTube and in the podcast. YouTube tends to have a heavily male audience just in general. So you're probably always going to be more heavily male in the podcast or in the YouTube space than on your audio podcast. But YouTube can change their mind at any given moment. Any given moment, they can say, we're demonetizing this. It's a huge problem for YouTube creators who don't also have a podcast platform. What we've seen with Apple and Spotify is way more resilience to any political pressures, probably because they're making a ton of money off of everything. But, Joe Rogan goes on Spotify. Neil Young, Joni Mitchell yanked all of their content from Spotify over Joe Rogan going to Spotify, and it's all been perfectly fine. There's been no fallout from that because that's how powerful Joe Rogan is to Spotify. So there's just more resilience among those two major platforms. And even if there's not, there are things like Locals, there are things like Rumble. There are all these new companies that are promising to give you access to the bandwidth and the platforming software, no matter what you say. Substack's another good example. They host podcasts and video now.
Yeah, so at the end of every episode of Econception, I encourage our listeners to leave a positive review. Lots of podcasts do this. Is that actually helping? Is that useful to me, or is that just something that people say? We don't really know if it actually works.
My understanding is that it does boost you in the algorithm, but I don't know the specifics of that. So I don't know, for example, if a big show suddenly gets a flurry of reviews, if that'll help it climb the charts or if that'll help Apple feature it. I don't know if it works for smaller shows and it gets them more likely to be put higher up in the ratings on Apple's side or on Chartable or anything like that. I genuinely don't know. It is supposed to help. I've never talked about that with Apple, but I imagine that it does legitimately boost you in one way or another just to have reviews. It's the same thing with YouTube, that the platform sees if you're liking the content or if people are engaging with the content, not necessarily liking it. So if people are even raging in the comment section, they're more likely to push that video out because it's gotten people to spend more time on their website. So it would sort of stand to reason that if you're showing you like this product, then Apple sees it may be more valuable, even if it's just a matter of algorithmically boosting it in one way or another. Apple isn't a social media platform, which is the great thing about Apple Podcasts, that it doesn't, just favor people who are juicing it. There's just a sense of equality that's not like on algorithmic social media, but they do obviously still use algorithms in one way or another to recommend things. Recommended to listeners of National Review, Dominic, recommended to listeners of Federalist Radio Hour, Emily. So it does work. I imagine it does help in one way or another.
All right, you heard it from Emily. Make sure to leave a positive review of the show. Thanks so much for talking to us about this, Emily. It's fascinating, and best of luck on your podcast, which are, again, Undercurrents with Unheard and Counterpoints is her other one. So make sure to give those a listen as well.
Thanks, Dominic.
The CHIPS Act is one of the most significant parts of United States industrial policy that has been started recently. The U.S. has done a lot of industrial policy all throughout its history. A lot of it hasn't been so great. But the CHIPS Act is sort of this new wave of industrial policy focused supposedly on national security issues and on competition with China. Now, there was a recent headline in recent news from the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC, which is one of the world's largest producers of semiconductors, and as the name suggests, is based in Taiwan. They've built a plant in Arizona, and the news was that they have achieved early production yields at their first plant in Arizona that surpass similar factories back home, which is a significant breakthrough for a U.S. expansion project initially dogged by delays and worker strife. That was according to Bloomberg reporting the news. Now, the Bloomberg did not attribute this to the CHIPS Act, although you can probably find people who are, and proponents of the CHIPS Act are certainly looking for success stories because there's been a lot of bad press around a lot of the requirements that are in there, which mostly have nothing to do with actually building semiconductors. They have lots of things to do with labor unions, lots of things to do with sort of childcare standards and all these other things that are sort of getting in the way of actually going through with a lot of these products. And also, there's long-standing problems in the U.S. from the regulatory side and environmental regulations, especially that stand in the way of them being able to do that. So let's look at this very specific news, though, which is positive. It's positive news. Let's look at it very specifically, though, and see if it has anything to do with the CHIPS Act. So the first thing to notice about it is that TSMC announced that it was going to be investing this money in this facility in Arizona in May 2020. And they said they're going to put $12 billion into it, which is a lot of money. They said they were going to do this in May 2020. Well, that was a year before the CHIPS Act was even introduced. And it was 2 years before the CHIPS Act became law. So the fact that Arizona already seemed like a good place for them to make this investment before the federal money actually showed up is one sign that it probably doesn't have a lot to do with the federal money. And we know this about TSMC in Arizona because they've been talking about this project as far back as 2013. And they announced it in May of 2020, of actually going forward with it. But they've been sort of interested in this for years beforehand. The governor of Arizona at the time visited Taipei in 2013, and TSMC talked about that being a potential location for them to expand to in the United States. And Arizona, as a state, has been cultivating that relationship with Taiwan for a very long time. Phoenix became a sister city with Taipei in 1979. And Arizona opened a trade office in Taiwan in 1987. And even before that, the then senator from Arizona, Barry Goldwater, who was the Republican nominee for president in 1964, but in 1978, he was still the senator from Arizona, and he sued Jimmy Carter because Jimmy Carter had reneged on a treaty that the U.S. had with Taiwan and as part of the process of normalizing relations with China, mainland China, People's Republic of China. Taiwan is, of course, officially named the Republic of China. And so when Carter did that, Goldwater sued, and that was noticed in Taiwan. And Goldwater was very pro-Taiwan for his entire career as part of his anti-communist beliefs. Now, you might say this timing thing is whatever, but it's nonetheless true that TSMC has not actually received any money from the CHIPS Act yet. In fact, almost no money has actually been given from the CHIPS Act, even though it was passed a little over 2 years ago now. And so TSMC has not received any money from it. They're supposed to get money in the future, but they have not actually gotten any yet. So it's kind of hard to give the act credit for something that has so far not actually given any money. And the bigger beneficiary of the CHIPS Act is supposed to be Intel. Intel being a US-based company. Again, TSMC is based in Taiwan, as the name would suggest. And really, this United States program, if it's about US national development, should really be benefiting US companies, and that's what it's designed to do. Intel is supposed to be getting much more money than TSMC is supposed to be getting. It also hasn't gotten that money yet, but Intel is in very rough shape right now. They are in the process of sort of restructuring the whole company. They laid off 15,000 people, which is 5,000 more jobs than they said the CHIPS Act investment was going to add. They said that was going to add 10,000. Well, they've already laid off 15,000 for other reasons. And so what's really going on here? Well, this is a positive example of what happens when you allow foreign investment in the United States. It's great that Taiwan Semiconductor feels that it should be putting $12 billion into the U.S. economy. That's a positive sign for the U.S. economy. That means that foreigners believe it's a good place to invest their money, and they believe that they're going to get a return on that investment. And they believed that before they had any guarantees from the CHIPS Act of getting federal money. And so when politicians talk at other times about blocking foreign direct investment because basically icky foreigners, there's really not a lot other reasoning behind it. We've seen this example with the steel industry where politicians of both parties have supported blocking investment from Nippon Steel, which is a Japanese steel company, in buying U.S. steel. In the process of blocking that investment, they're preventing this kind of success from happening in the steel industry that is happening in the semiconductor industry. Now, I should say that I'm not an expert on how semiconductors are actually made, and I don't know how much to actually make of this supposed breakthrough that Bloomberg was reporting on. Maybe this is it seems to be a preliminary thing. Maybe in the future it will turn around and it will be a failure. But that's all the more reason why we really shouldn't want the government to be too involved with it, because if it fails and it's just TSMC's money on the line, then it's TSMC's problem. But if it fails and it's U.S. taxpayer money on the line, then it's everybody's problem, because now you've got a situation where the government is wasting taxpayer money on a business that probably shouldn't have had it in the first place. It's important to remember, too, that even if the CHIPS Act succeeds on its own goals, even if the CHIPS Act moves a bunch of production of semiconductors back to the United States and does it in the way that the government planners want it to, that still does not prove that the CHIPS Act was a good policy. And the reason for that is opportunity cost. All of the money that went to the CHIPS Act is money that could have gone somewhere else. It either could have gone to some other purpose within the government, or, because this money was borrowed, it would have gone to the private sector. Every time the government borrows money, that is money that cannot be borrowed by the private sector. And the government is always going to have the first priority on this when it comes to borrowing, because they can print money to pay you back. No company has that kind of power. And so proponents of industrial policy not only have to actually come true on their promises, they have to also demonstrate that their promises are better than what that money could have been used on otherwise. It's a high bar to clear. I don't think they're going to clear it with semiconductors. And at least so far, even with this example of a supposed success, it's not really because of the CHIPS Act. Now, international economic competition is not just about subsidies in industrial policy, it's also about taxes. And this is something that the United States has come to understand. We used to have the highest corporate tax rate in the developed world at 35%. Tax Cuts and Jobs Act in 2017 lowered that to 21%, which is about the average. So we still don't really have a low corporate tax. And when you include state corporate taxes on top of that, that on average brings the corporate tax rate in the United States to 25.8%, which is a little bit above average for the world. So we still have some work to do there. And also, there are other aspects of the tax code that set the U.S. back. There's an interesting blog post from Tax Foundation comparing U.S. business taxation to China on business taxation. And you might be thinking, well, China's a communist country. They must have a terrible business tax code. And they do in a lot of respects. But there are certain key areas where China's more internationally competitive than the U.S. is. And this is something that policymakers should look at. So this post from Tax Foundation points to four basic things. The first thing is that China relies more on consumption taxes than on income taxes for its revenue. And this is a long-standing problem with the United States tax code, is that we rely more on income taxes. Now, all taxes are economically harmful, but some are more harmful than others. And consumption taxes in general are less harmful than income taxes. When Donald Trump was out there talking about how he wants to replace the income tax with tariffs, he's talking about something that's mathematically impossible and that would have all sorts of negative effects. However, he's not totally wrong to be saying that income taxes are worse taxes than consumption taxes. Tariff is a form of a consumption tax. It's a particularly bad consumption tax because it lends itself to lots and lots of special interest rent seeking through domestic companies begging government to protect them from foreign competition. And then if those protectionist measures actually work, they end up not raising any revenue because now you've prevented these imports from coming in. And if the imports aren't coming in, they're not being taxed. We've talked about this before on eConception. But a broad-based consumption tax with a relatively low rate, something similar to sales taxes that we have at the state level, although those could be improved too, would be a better form of taxation than an income tax. And we've seen this move at the state level where lots of states are moving to either reduce, simplify, or entirely eliminate their income taxes. And so moving the U.S. to a more consumption tax base does not mean copying China. It would actually mean being more like the rest of the developed world. Most of the countries in the OECD rely more on consumption taxes than we do here. And so this is a long-standing problem, but it's also a problem where the U.S. compares unfavorably with China. The second issue is that corporate tax rate. Like I said, it's about the same. China's corporate tax rate is 25%. The U.S. corporate tax rate, when you include the average state corporate tax rate, is 25.8%. So it's basically the same. We should not be taxing our companies just as much as communist China. That's not a good idea. Now, what China does as well, which is a bad idea, is that they have lots of different special carve-outs for certain industries. Some don't pay taxes at all, others pay special lower rates. That kind of thing is a really bad idea. The U.S. should just seek to lower the rate for everybody. But as things currently stand right now, the legal rate in China is 25%, and the average rate in the U.S., when you include states, is 25.8%. Third thing is that China does not have any depreciation schedules that go out for 39 years like the United States does. Their longest ones are only for 20 years, and they allow a lot more things to be deducted immediately. This, too, is a long-standing problem with the U.S. tax code that really doesn't have anything to do with China, but it is just a thing where we compare unfavorably with China. The key thing here is that businesses are allowed to write off their payroll expenses in full every year. And they should be able to do that, right? We don't want to punish businesses for hiring more people. That's bad. At the same time, we don't want to punish businesses either for investing in new equipment or building new factories or any other different kinds of physical investments that they can make as opposed to investing in their workforce. But right now, if you want to do that, you don't get to write off the investment in full the year that you do it. You have to do it based on these different depreciation schedules. And for physical structures, so the biggest investments that you make, typically for a lot of businesses, that depreciation schedule goes out for 39 years. So it's not 39 years later, you still haven't recovered the full cost of what you're doing, or the full cost of the investment. It's bad tax policy. It should be neutral between investments in payroll and investments in physical structures, equipment, machinery, that kind of thing, because those things help workers. And obviously those things don't work without workers. So both are needed and both should be treated equally in the tax code, which means that they should both be allowed to be written off in full in the year that the investment is made. China allows more of this, the US doesn't. Also, Chinese companies, this is the fourth thing, Chinese companies get to write off 200% of their research and development costs immediately. In the US, that is also subject to different depreciation schedules. Now, again, we don't want to be writing off 200%. That means you're basically subsidizing R&D through the tax code, which creates all kinds of bad incentives for Chinese companies to plunge a bunch of money into that probably should be going elsewhere. So that would be a bad thing to do. Nothing in this segment should be saying to copy China on tax policy. That's not the point. The point is just to look at things where you have China has the more internationally competitive tax provisions, and just see, hey, how can we fix this in the U.S. so that it doesn't look that way? So what that would look like here is just allowing a 100% write-off in the year that the R&D happens. Again, that's the same principle behind the different kinds of investment in physical products. All this stuff should be treated equally in the tax code. Right now, it's very biased against investment in physical assets and in favor of investment in workforce. So we just want to make the U.S. tax code more neutral, and by doing that, you're making it more competitive. You'd be encouraging more investment, and encouraging more investment means more economic growth. This is much better in a budgetary sense than simply cutting tax rates. The reason for that is that investment is the thing that you really want. You want companies to be investing money in better productivity, because productivity growth is ultimately the thing that drives higher wages, and that's the thing that drives better living standards. And so there are already proposals on the table to do this. Things like 100% write-offs for physical investment and for R&D. Those proposals are already out there. Also, for longer-lived physical assets, a thing called neutral cost recovery, which says that you still have that schedule, except that it is adjusted for inflation and it's adjusted for a risk-free rate of return. And so by the time you get to the end of that schedule, it's mathematically the same as if you had been able to write it off all at once. So it just helps to make that transition a little bit easier from where we currently are, while still getting the same economic result. And the total cost of this kind of stuff, Tax Foundation points out, would be about $623 billion over 10 years. Now, that's a lot of money. Relative to the federal budget, it's not that much. And it's certainly a lot cheaper than the industrial policy stuff that the U.S. has been doing instead the last couple of years. CHIPS Act and the Inflation Reduction Act combined are going to cost about $1.2 trillion over the next 10 years. So for about half that, we could have broad-based policy reforms that benefit all industries, not just the ones that politicians pick, and would do so at less cost to the federal budget, and would lead to more economic growth and more jobs in more industries. That seems like the better way to go. Now it's time for the paper of the episode, but before that, as I already mentioned with Emily, if you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave us a positive review wherever you get your podcasts. It does help us to know you enjoy the show, and it makes the show more visible for others to start listening as well. For the paper of the episode, I'm doing a classic that we haven't talked about yet from the American Economic Review in September 1945. If you already know where I'm going, special prize for you. By F.A. Hayek. It's The Use of Knowledge in Society. So this is a really important paper, not only for free market economics, but just for social sciences in general. This has been a revolutionary paper across the board. It's one of the things that supposedly inspired the founders of Wikipedia. And it also gets into some of the things we were talking about earlier with podcasts. Because podcasts, the existence of podcasts, the spread of podcasts, is confirmation of Hayek's thesis in Use of Knowledge in Society, which is that knowledge is spread out. It's not all in one place. Lots of different people have different knowledge on different things. And that's why it's impossible to centrally plan an economy. It's not a matter of creating a computer powerful enough to model everything. Even if you had such a computer, and hey, computers today are pretty good. Even if you had such a computer, you wouldn't be able to know all of the information you need to know to put in as an input to the computer to actually get the right result as an output. What Hayek says here is that there's no single mind, is the term he uses, that possesses all of the knowledge that's relevant to plan an economy. Now, this is my sort of spin on this essay, and I hope it's interesting to you. I think it's interesting. I read this essay as Hayek saying, you guys aren't God. If there was a single mind that had all of the knowledge in a society to plan it adequately, to plan it with a purpose behind it, that would be God. That's what God does. That's not what people do. And Hayek is saying, none of you are that single mind. No government is that single mind. But also, no businessman is that single mind. None of you are. You're not God. And what use of knowledge in society should teach us is to be humble about what we can know, be humble about what we think we can plan, and ultimately to do so for betterment of society so that we don't make these kind of mistakes from centrally planning, which will inevitably arise. Inevitably. It is not a matter of skill. It is not a matter of information. These problems will inevitably arise because that knowledge is so spread out. And that's Hayek's brilliant insight. So that's all for today. Remember that the economy is complicated and nobody has all the answers, but markets work.